Hi friends, Carl again here with Calm Survival, and today we're going to look at some different fuels. Now in our concept of the rule of threes, air, water, and food, fuel will play a part in all three of those aspects. The reason we're going to cover fuels first is because from there we can then look at stoves, and then look at utensils and other things that will go with them. Even if you're just thinking about the small what ifs, normal power outages, things like that, it's always good to have a second method for cooking, because the world doesn't always give us one thing to deal with at a time. So right now, everybody's stuck at home. A lot of restaurants are closed. Well, what happens if you do have to cook for yourself? Since we're doing this all in hard mode, for me, restaurants are pretty much off the table, even if they are open. So what's the backup plan? Starting off here in the corner, we've got some charcoal. Now that could be charcoal, wood, processed wood pellets, any kind of dead tree carcass, complex hydrocarbon. And it can get used in a lot of different ways. You might be in love with your Weber kettle Q, and that's awesome. You probably also then know there are some days where you really don't want to use it. It's really difficult to use inside. Even if your house has a built-in fireplace or little wood stove, you need to be pretty experienced to get good efficiency and good safety out of it. A lot of little partial use fireplaces and wood stoves aren't going to stand up to consistent, constant use. Also, baking and cooking and things like that, they get really quite difficult. So it's a skill in and of itself. Now, if you have that skill, that's excellent, because charcoal and wood fire can give you some advantages that other fuels can't. When it comes to food storage, the barbecue master, the pit master, is going to have an advantage for preserving meats and other things like that other people won't have. So you may still be able to get food, but food storage may become the concern and not necessarily just cooking it. So depending on where you live, it can be a good option. If you live in an apartment, probably not. It's also just bulky. The amount you're going to need for any sustained length of time, you might have a concept of how often you go through a bag of charcoal, but if you're starting from new, it's a lot more than you think. Many times more than you think. So, got some good sides, got some downsides. Next up, we've got these little fuel tablets. Okay, this is hexamine. It's been around for over 100 years at this point. Each of these little fuel tablets will boil a bit of water. It depends on a lot of factors, but if we assume that one tablet will cover a cup of water, then, well, we got 24 cups of water. It's compact, but that's not a lot of actual cooking. And whatever temperature you get is what you get. There's no adjustability on this. Now, out of all the options, this is going to be the cheapest, but it comes with the most compromises. The fumes from this are not good for you. Now, as a foxhole cooker, when there's other things that are more dangerous around you, you can see why that was the choice of armies for a very long time. But I've had it damage equipment. If it's been stored in with things, it will damage different kinds of fabrics, different synthetics. It'll take the paint off stuff. I've had it strip and react with the anodizing on some things. So it's pretty nasty stuff. Shelf life wise, it will last a really long time. You just have to make sure you're storing it away from everything else where it's got fresh air. but not my choice for cooking inside because those fumes, as I said, they're not great. Now, anytime we're cooking inside, we should have a battery-powered carbon monoxide detector, some good ventilation. Your local circumstances will determine that. Cooking indoors in the winter compared to the summer, depending on where you live, can have a big impact on what the outcome is going to be. But in general, charcoal is going to be an outside fuel unless you've got very specific equipment built into your house, and the hexamine, definitely an outside fuel. So now we're going to get into gas fuels, gaseous pressurized fuels. First thing we've got is just straight up butane. Okay, you'll often see these referred to as fly spray cans, because when you take the lid off, they kind of have that aerosol can kind of style. The cookers that are designed to work with these are usually pretty small, about the size of a large hot plate, so they're easy to tuck away. And fuel-wise, these are pretty cheap. Now, I won't talk exact prices because different countries, different areas, all of that is going to have a big impact on the price you're going to pay. However, as a point of comparison to sort of a minimum wage, from what I've seen, this hexamine cooker, also called Esbit, if you see Esbit stove, that's what they're meaning. That's going to be about 3/4 of an hour at a minimum wage in most places. They're really cheap. A pack of about 6 of these and the cooker, probably a couple of hours. The 6-pack of this butane and one of these big camping fuel cans, probably about the same price. These guys are cheap. The disadvantage is it's pure butane. So it doesn't have the heat output of some of the other fuels. It doesn't have the cold weather performance of some of the other fuels. But as long as these are even close to room temperature, they work just fine. Okay, you're not heating your house with it. It's going to work quite well. So as something that you can take to the park, something that you can have on hand, where I live right now, a lot of people have one of the little, they call them lunchbox cookers, little single burner stove, just riding around the trunk of their car. Just, you never know when you're going to want to boil up some tea. So pretty big advantage there. They do come, you can get 2-burner stoves and things like that that use those. But we'll get into that later. Now this camping fuel, it's pretty common stuff. You can get it in a lot of places. The valve is the important part. They pretty much all use this standard type of valve now, even though the stove manufacturer will tell you to use their particular kind of fuel. The valves are all a standard. Now the fuel mix in these is usually going to be isobutane and propane. Sometimes it's butane only and propane. And the exact ratio will depend on the brand, where you're buying it, who's manufacturing it. You can do some research and there's some guesses out there. But in general, they're going to be reasonably close. You will pay for the quality, depending on the brand you're buying. But you notice I've got 3 different sizes of cans, and that's where this can bring an advantage. That little can has a net weight of about 100 grams. Normally they're called 110s because some of them can be up to 110. This one is 227. Usually these are called 220s or 230s just because most of them are 220 or 230. And this one is 450. Normally these are called 440s. So if somebody's talking, you're reading what somebody's referring to, they say a 440 gram can, this is the size. Now, price-wise, the little can and this one are going to be within $1 of each other. They really don't have much difference in cost. So that small can, it's going to be good if you're needing to carry it. It's not a lot of fuel. It'll last one person a few days, but you're going to have to be pretty careful with it. This big can is not twice as expensive as the mid-size can. Probably about 1.5 to 1 3/4 the price. So obviously, buy in bulk, you get cheaper price, and weight-wise, this can is not twice as heavy as the mid-size can. Obviously, you don't have the bottom and things like that. So that can be an advantage. These are, however, not refillable. Wink, wink. If you are going to try, be super careful, do a lot of research. Butane has a very low vapor pressure. Propane has a very high vapor pressure. This can is much more beefy. The seams are welded. You do not want to make a mistake with one of these and have it go off. So, legally speaking, these are not refillable. And to be honest, the gear that you can buy to refill them tends to be pretty dodgy. So, know what you're getting into. Don't just take one blog post off the internet and give it a try. These are probably pretty familiar to a lot of people. These are normally called 1-pounders because of the weight. But depending on where you live, you can get refillable propane tanks in all manner of sizes. The limits are going to depend on what your just local availability is, as well as what you can legally carry in the type of vehicle you own. So I have a 3-kilogram bottle. That's going to last, I don't know. I've filled it once and I've used it a lot. So you'll be able to judge that out as you use it. But when the 1-pounders are on sale, grabbing a couple of them, just making sure that I know roughly how much fuel I have. And that's a pretty big advantage. If you already have a barbecue, you can easily get adapters, totally legal adapters, that will run that standard barbecue tank into a nice 2-burner gas cooktop that you can easily use inside. A little bit easier to use with your pots and pans than trying to use them on your outdoor grill. So propane has a bunch of big advantages. It's typically very available. Propane typically will be available sooner than a lot of other fuel types if that's what you're relying on. Because it gets used in heating so often, the infrastructure is there to get propane to people a lot sooner than other fuels. When the big Ontario-Quebec ice storm happened, people were able to get propane long before the power came back on. Propane resupply was one of the things that was possible. It's also, because it's so standardized, you know your fittings are going to work. With some of these cans, there's a few other styles around that are a bit more antique, a bit more out of service. They still show up in different regional locations. And if that was all you got and you didn't have a stove for it, it doesn't do you any good. These guys, well, you can afford to have a stockpile of them. A few boxes of them, you're going to be good for some time. If you're stuck in an apartment, space might be at a premium. But again, if you're using them all the time, you'll know how long they last. That's sort of how that's going to play out. Okay? Now we're going to get into the liquid fuels. All right. So first one up, we've got methylated spirits, alcohol. Now there are different alcohols, different types. Most of the time you're going to find, if you look up the SDS or MSDS sheet on whichever brand you're getting, it's probably industrial ethanol with some sort of additive to make it undrinkable. They typically don't use poisons anymore for that. It's usually Bitrex, which is pretty foul stuff. That'll come into a factor for us a little bit later. But we want to be looking at all of the alcohol-based fuels kind of together. Gel fuels, sterno, things like that. Big advantage to this, doesn't have a lot of fumes, doesn't have a lot of soot and smoke, so you can cook inside with this if you're being careful, and that's going to relate to our stove setup later on. Also really handy just around the house as a cleaner, things like that. It lasts a really long time. It will absorb water from the air, but if you have a full bottle with a good sealed lid, it doesn't really go off. Okay, it becomes a little bit less effective, but not by much. So alcohol is going to be one of the options to look at. When we get to the stoves, we're going to end up making some compromises there. So we'll see then. Next we have shellite, which is also known as white gas, Coleman fuel, has a bunch of different names depending on where you live. It's essentially gasoline without the additives that would help it run better in your car. Now, that means it's got all the downsides of gasoline. The fumes are not great. It will produce some smoke, not a lot, but depending on how you're using it, it can be a bit tricky, a bit finicky, and shelf life wise, it will start to break down. So this isn't a buy it and 5 years from now, hope it works. You're going to have to be cycling this stuff through, making sure it's staying fresh, which is a downside. Following on from shellite or white gas is kerosene, and that's basically diesel fuel, minus all the stuff that would make it run well in an engine. Lots more smoke. Now, kerosene and white gas are pretty close when it comes to energy density. It depends on how you measure them out. So one of them has a little bit more energy density based on weight, the other based on volume. They're close as makes no difference, unless you're talking major expedition level. What your compromises are isn't going to matter. Kerosene, again, is going to have that shelf life concern. And again, probably not going to want to use it inside. Your little range hood is not going to be enough ventilation to get that smoke, to get that smell out. It may be a small thing, and look, they do work. But if you read any of the kind of diary entries from any long expeditions, the guys that's, got stuck in ships, trapped in ice, or stuck down on the South Pole, one of the things that they do actually mention is just the fact that the smell of their cooking fuel all the time, every day, just started to wear on them. If you're going to have to cook for a couple of weeks because you don't have power, you don't want that all the time in your house. So the gas fuels are definitely going to have that advantage, but it really comes down to what your other purposes are for. If all you want is just I need to shove it in a corner and it needs to be cheap, just the butane is probably going to be your plan, but maybe the propane if that's something you also are going to be using. So hopefully that gives you a bit of an overview on the major fuel types that are going to be things you're going to want to consider. As I said, in the next one, we're going to cover some different stoves, take a look at some of the pros and cons, how we can set those up so that you can make a good choice on what you actually want to use these for. Thanks for hanging out. This has been Calm Survival. I'm Carl. Stay safe out there.